Guys, today I'm going to compare the two best AoE carries in Genshin, Xiao and Neuvillette. In this video I'm going to take a look at their theoretical ceiling damage on multiple teams at cheap investment and see how it translates to practical scenarios. First of all, even excluding the AoE part, they're rather similar characters because they both have very long rotations, like their team rotations are both around 25 seconds. They both massively benefit from Furina on several of their top teams. Also, neither of them is reliant on reactions to deal damage. Neuvillette can technically be used on vaporized teams, but he certainly doesn't rely on them. The one definitive advantage Neuvillette had until recently is that it's always been kinda more mobile than Xiao. This is because before patch 4.4, Xiao was really tied to Bennett on his teams to reach his theoretical ceiling of damage. Being restricted to play within a small circle really limited the AoE potential Xiao had in the past because it's just a poor fit when you have to face multiple waves of opponents. And that's precisely why replacing Bennett with Xiao in 4.4 made Xiao even more similar to Neuvillette than he already was, because he now doesn't have any kind of positional restriction. Not only that, this release also just gave him more options, because before Xiao came out, Xiao kinda relied on both Faruzan Constellation 6 and Bennett to be a competent carry. Faruzan was especially a problem because of how hard she was to pull for all the Xiao mains. But now, with both Furina and Xiao in the mix, he gains more options, and this is great. On the flip side, Neuvillette never had any sort of particular restrictions in terms of teammates to be great. Yes, Furina is incredibly good with him, but he's still very good without her. This is because his base damage, so damage without supports, is probably the highest in the game. But to counterbalance that, Neuvillette doesn't have access to the kind of massive supports Xiao has access to. And that's just how the game balancing works. If Neuvillette had access to somebody like Faruzan but a Hydro, it will just be completely unfair. Let me remind you that if you enjoy my content but you haven't subbed yet, please consider doing so because it really helps me notice your support. Now, at a glance, it might look like Xiao is doing more damage than Neuvillette on his teams at equal investment, which is crazy. But an important disclaimer here is that Xiao's damage has more variables than Neuvillette's. For one, on the teams where he's paired with Xiao, since her buffs only apply to a single opponent, that means that if he's facing multiple opponents, only one of them will be receiving that kind of ceiling damage. Practically, in multi-opponent scenarios, that means that all the opponents excluding one are receiving 300 less damage. On top of that, Xiao also has another mechanic that specifically helps him in single target situations, and that is collision. Excluding very specific situations where you're facing multiple big opponents all grouped up together in the same spot, collision damage won't apply in AoE scenarios, and that further lowers Xiao's AoE damage. On the flip side, Neuvillette's damage is perfectly stable, like it doesn't go up, it doesn't go down, it's just stable in all scenarios, and that's what makes him so good. Still, it goes to Xiao's credit that he's able to deal so much single target damage, and for that reason is now a very good unit to use in boss rooms. To be honest, ever since Faruzan came out, Xiao has always been a pretty great single target unit with a very high damage per rotation, but the fact that his attacks had such a wide range kinda made people overlook this potential of his. But now, with Xiao in the mix, it's even more noticeable and it feels fantastic. Specifically, since his rotations are so long, his damage per rotation tends to be higher than most, and a well-invested Xiao with a 5-star weapon can even deal enough damage to kill most bosses in the abyss in a single rotation. What does this mean? Is Xiao better than Neuvillette in single target situations? Not quite. Neuvillette might not have the same upsides Xiao has in single target situations, but he has one big advantage, and that is Furina. Of course, both Xiao and Neuvillette can use Furina on their teams, but the thing is, Neuvillette can do it much better. In terms of the buffs she's receiving, Furina really doesn't have much on Xiao teams. Specifically, one big factor is that despite the team having multiple Anemo units on it that can potentially hold the very decent Menhir, it's just better to give them artifacts that buff Xiao, like the Tenacity of the Menhir for Faruzan or the Noblesse Oblige for Xiao. As a result, while Furina still ends up doing nice damage, it's not amazing. On Neuvillette teams, it's completely different because because her synergy with Neuvillette himself is just massive. For one, the Hydro Resonance that you get by using multiple Hydro characters on the team is already a pretty nice buff for Furina. Secondarily, Neuvillette's burst of HP loss and then self-heal speed up Furina's Panther stacks generation and increase the average damage bonus for the whole team compared to the Xiao variants. Last but not least, characters like Kazuha or a Zhongli holding the Petra set are just perfect fits on this team to magnify Neuvillette's damage, and of course, on top of doing that, they will also benefit Furina's damage significantly. As a result, the combination of Neuvillette and Furina can evenly compete with the combination of Xiao and Furina in single target situations, and that's just great for Neuvillette. Now let's talk team flexibility more in detail. As I said before, Xiao got more options now with Xianyun, Bennett, Zhongli, Furina, Feruzan. He has a lot of options, even the older Xiangling, Yelan all fit on his teams, but one thing that has stayed the same is that it kinda feels premium. Feruzan's Constellation 6 still feels massive for Xiao, like super massive actually. The difference between a Constellation 5 Feruzan and a Constellation 6 Feruzan on his teams is of a 30% team damage increase, which is honestly super absurd. Yes, I'm making up superlatives here, but that's how great Feruzan is, honestly. I've seen some people say things like, oh, Constellation 2 Feruzan is enough for Xiao, and yes, technically it's enough. Like if your aim is to clear the base, it's enough. But if you want to compare Xiao to the very best DPS in the meta, a Feruzan Constellation 6 is kinda needed. In terms of pure damage, if you don't have a Constellation 6 Feruzan, it's just better to use Bennett instead of her on the team. And while Bennett isn't the best because of his positional issues, he can be used still, for sure. And to be honest, the positioning thing also depends on the abyss you're facing, like the lineups, because for example, in the current abyss, the first side, the waves of opponents are just positioned in a way that they benefit Bennett very much. They're all perfectly lined up together when they spawn, so you need no grouping, and they're also pretty much all heavy opponents, so they won't be scattered when you plunge on them, and that makes it easy for you to keep them within the circle. Once they put out more varied abysses in terms of enemy disposition, that's when you'll feel the need of the Xianyun, Furina, Feruzan team, because it's much more mobile than the Bennett variants, and that just feels like a natural playstyle for a character like Xiao. Still, it needs to be said that without a Feruzan Constellation 6, a year ago Xiao was just kinda bad, while now is still decent, just not top tier, but still pretty decent. Neuvillette is more consistent in terms of playstyle on the other hand, because while his damage can definitely fluctuate between teams, he mostly always feels the same. One misconception some people have about Neuvillette is that they think he needs Furina, but that's not the case. He's still great without her, and if you're comparing Furina to Feruzan, for example, Xiao definitely needs Feruzan Constellation 6 more than Neuvillette needs Furina. For example, a team I like a lot for him is the Vaporate's team with Xiangling, Nahida and Kazuha, because his Vaporate's damage can be absurdly high. Like his damage ceiling on those teams is comparable to what he can generate on the Furina teams, so it feels great. Talking more about playstyle now, I started this video talking about the AoE part of things, and in terms of playstyle, Neuvillette feels more consistent than Xiao at dealing AoE damage. The thing about Xiao is that while the range of his attacks is definitely pretty wide, he still feels quite a bit more static than Neuvillette is, because Neuvillette is just blasting in horizontal range and moving around freely, and is hitting all opponents very consistently, while with Xiao you need to strategize more. Like with Xiao, if you want to hit all opponents, you still have to position yourself between all of them, and that's kind of a requirement, while with Neuvillette you have more freedom of movement, really. And the problem with this with Xiao is that he doesn't have grouping, so in some situations it might get hard for him to hit all opponents, while Neuvillette will be able to do it more consistently. And to wrap this up, I will definitely consider Neuvillette to be the stronger meta unit, because he is more consistent, in AoE he is better, in single target his teams are comparable really, and he has less requirements in terms of a team. But for Xiao, a year 1 unit to be even comparable with the strongest carry in the meta, that's just very impressive honestly, and is now a top tier DPS. And with this, I'm done for today. Make sure to go check out the latest video I did on Yae Miko, and peace!